It's the middle of the 1800s, and you are the son or daughter of one of Europe's kings. There aren't many realms you could be in, take your pick. The important thing is that your father has just asked you to step up and take some responsibility in your future kingdom. And you want to make the house of Henk St. Mankelan van der Kleinferts proud. It's about the horses. You see, horses are needed from everything from working the fields to equipping your kingdom's fine cavalry. The thing is, a war horse does not a good workhorse make. The former needs speed and grace, and the latter needs strength and patience. But horses do not grow on trees, nor are they an infinite resource. The upshot is that your kingdom must focus on one type of equine, work or riding. Choose wrong and you may suffer the consequence of expensive imports or impotence in the event of war. So what do you choose? Luckily, life is an open book test, and you can gaze beyond your borders to see what others are choosing and why. Let us explore the factors behind choosing your kingdom's equestrian policy. Horses. Whether for work or for war, before the age of the automobile, these animals represented the best way to move things or yourself over land, making them, if not man's best friend, then at least his hardest working one. At the beginning of the 1800s, with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo a fresh memory, there was not much of a divide between war horses, or more properly, riding horses, and work horses. Armies of the time were prone to using whatever farm horses they could round up for their campaigning, and even the most rickety farm nag was able to pull some kind of cart. At that time, the question was more about how to supply horses in general than in parsing the best breed. Countries were divided on the best way a steady supply of horses could be secured, the difference boiling down into two broad camps. The first was the foundation of state studs. Pioneered by the government of Louis XIV, these enterprises were essentially government-sponsored stables and training facilities, dedicated to the breeding of a certain standard of horse. Much like any animal, a horse's bloodline is critical to determining how it looked and acted, with factors such as strength, speed, and even temperament carefully controlled through pre-selected heredity. By ensuring that desirable stallions sired or fathered with suitable mares, France could ensure that a supply of good horses would always be available for its armies. Drawing upon the French model, state stud farms began to spread throughout continental Europe. Prussia expanded upon the idea of creating a supply of suitable cavalry horses to improving the quality of the kingdom's horse stock in general. In 1786, the previously court stable at Trakehnen was converted to a state stud. A small herd of stallions and mares were maintained there, and at various times deployed to smaller regional studs across Prussia. Farmers would then be able to take their horses to be covered, or bred, with the Trakehner horses, improving the traits of the farmers' subsequent foals. Additionally, Trakehner horses were sold to farmers for work, who, after a few years, would be able to resell their horses to the military to serve as cavalry mounts, a win-win situation for agriculture and army. Beyond France and Prussia, state studs spread around Europe, until, by the mid-19th century, most major countries possessed one, or many, each tending to specialize in a set of breeds. Prussia produced the aforementioned hardy Trakehner, Austria's stables produced the famous performing Lipizaners, Russia's stud in its Polish province specialized in Arabians, Württemberg and Hanover solid workhorses for the Rhineland, and Spain and Portugal their own cavalry mounts. The second camp for horse breeding methods was adopted by the notable exception to the state stud trend, Great Britain. In Britain, it was decided that a supply of horses should be left to the private market, which the government would be able to tap into in times of war. The idea was that in the hands of private citizens working in their best interests, the quality of horses would slowly be raised across the nation. A prominent pillar of this theory was horse racing. It was thought in Britain that the best trait to be looked for in a cavalry horse was speed, which was the same requirement looked for in a racehorse. By encouraging the level race, that is, the traditionally flat race around a racetrack, private individuals seeking to better their odds in races would naturally push for a stock of faster and faster horses, again, improving the horses the cavalry would draw upon in wartime. Each system naturally had its drawbacks. State studs were expensive, elitist, and in the words of one critic, stud officials believe out of half-baked pride that their art is something better and higher than breeding cattle, sheep, and pigs, who did not have their own state-sponsored breeding facilities. The control of the horse stock was left in the hands of the few, who didn't necessarily have the needs of the whole kingdom in mind when selecting what traits to breed for in state studs. The English model was not flawless either, even starting with the basic premise that speed trumped all else when it came to breeding saddle horses. On the contrary, on the continent, the flat race was not always the sport of choice among officers and gentlemen seeking to show off their horsemanship. Just as popular was the steeplechase, a race over uneven country terrain that looked more like a horse obstacle course with ditches, gullies, and small cliffs to hurdle. These features required much more out of a horse than pure speed, and were thought to better represent battlefield conditions, which was not always a pristine flat field. More importantly, though, when the time for war came, the military had to compete with the private market when it came to horse procurement, which in some cases led to being overcharged for lesser quality horses. However, all these considerations thus far have largely been focused on riding horses. Horses are well-known beasts of burden, and those burdens are quite often not humans. European-style agriculture has long depended on horses as means to work farm implements, from pulling farm tools like plows through the field to bringing a farmer's produce via wagon to market. As mentioned before, for centuries the horses used for farm work and the horses used for the military had been, on the whole, one and the same. But after Napoleon, things were beginning to change quickly. Contrary to what one may imagine, the Industrial Revolution did not do away with horses. At least until the mass production of the internal combustion engine, horses were needed more than ever before. Bigger, stronger horses were needed to haul goods to and from factories, with stables in cities being as ubiquitous as today's automobile parking lots. Horses were also needed to move people, not as individuals, but via trams and trolleys. 18th century canal projects continued into the 19th, with horses employed to walk alongside waterways to haul people en masse to their destination. Agriculture was not left behind in innovation. The McCormick reaper, the steel-bladed plow, the straddle-row cultivator, and even the lawnmower were new innovations that required horsepower to operate. In Central Europe, farmers began to demand horses that would be up to the task of operating newer and heavier equipment. Not only were larger horses desired, but also those with more calm temperaments. Even today, the classification warm blood and cold blood separate horses by fiery and energetic dispositions in the former, and calmer and even personalities in the latter. To put it in more concrete terms, according to a study by the Journal of German Agricultural Breeding, areas with a preponderance of warm-blooded horses had 3 times the equine-related accidents than areas with mainly cold-blooded horses. While many cavalrymen wished for their horses to be spirited, the last thing a farmer wanted was for his plow horse to suddenly charge the neighbor's fence. But initial responses from government stud farms for more suitable workhorses were muted. Frustrated German farmers in the Rhineland began to import heavier Flemish horses from Belgium, the Brabant being particularly sought after. Price data shows that heavy horses in the Rhineland tripled in price between the 1850s and the 1860s, and the lack of domestic workhorse breeding began to be a serious drain on the economy as Belgian imports had to fill the gap. Clearly, national horse policies had to be assessed. But it was not so straightforward as breed heavier horses. Remember, militaries still demanded riding horses for cavalry mounts, and they argued that for a national policy to switch completely to procuring workhorses would leave the nation at risk of military impotence. In the words of one breeder, Richard Schoenbeck, "Though we are at present able to satisfy demands of the cavalry domestically, if the breeding of cold-blooded horses were to continue apace, it would be difficult to satisfy demand in the event of war. This was not idle speculation. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, the Prussian army had to replace its entire stock of horses over the course of the fighting 3 times, totaling over 1 million horses. The problem was that private, and increasingly public breeders were, in his mind, choosing private interest over patriotic duty. It was simply more profitable to raise horses that could be sold to a wider market than just the military. Schoenbeck was fighting a losing war. In 1876, riding horses outnumbered work horses like the Brabant by a ratio of 48-1. By 1910, the heavy horse had almost reached parity with the light horse. Many government studs began to shift their breeding programs to favor industry over the military. In Britain, where the state stud had been dismissed in favor of laissez-faire, demand began to outpace supply. Horses from all over had to be imported, and this neglect proved expensive. According to R.J. Moore Coiler, during the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902, 300 horses died per day during the war. Besides the inherent tragedy of so many lost equines, the loss came at a huge monetary cost as well. Over 500,000 riding horses had to be dispatched to South Africa as remounts, and of those, only 16% originated in Britain. It wasn't until the middle of the First World War, a conflict that killed between 6 and 8 million horses, did Britain finally establish its own national stud. In the end, the horse question was as perplexing as any to those who had to make tough choices in the midst of technological change. Returning to the example of your kingdom, it is not obvious that riding horses will be obsolete in a few decades, in which time huge amounts of them would be needed and may prove costly to supply if you didn't raise them yourself. Nor was it entirely clear that heavier horses would be in such high demand in both agriculture and industry, with many innovations not requiring less horsepower, but more. If you can keep war at a distance and have a sizable industrial base to power, like the United States, you could benefit massively through the production of only workhorses, which, in the end, are the ultimate drivers of your economy. But to completely forgo the possibility of war may leave your military without a crucial component of national defense, and may leave you at the mercy of someone who didn't. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. It's been a little while since this horse-flavored history channel did a video on horses, but I hope you were able to enjoy this one. It certainly was a dilemma whether to go for a horse that would make your kingdom prosper, but leave you weaker on the battlefield. What would you have done if you had to decide? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I really appreciate your responses and always read every one of them. I hope you all have a wonderful day.